where this is how they studied the shedding of vaccines, was they took a litter of puppies and they only gave one puppy the vaccine and then tested them all for titers later, and they all had immunity, but only one was vaccinated. And so that's how they started finding out that the vaccine can shed. And that was what became something that was so important. But trying to get other veterinarians on board and understanding that, which is going to lead me to my next question to you. We're struggling really hard. The goal of Joey's Legacy, Scott, the main goal is to get our laws changed. We got to get these laws changed to hold these veterinarians accountable.
Yes,
my
absolutely.
question is, if we can get more veterinarians to raise their standard, right? If we, as pet parents, the responsibility on us is to force veterinarians to raise their standard, and you get cases, and if we could just get more veterinarians to raise their standard, would that help in court?
Well, yeah, I think it's just that the standard is already there. It's just more of getting other veterinarians to recognize that, well, I guess I should take it in two parts. Recognize that these standards have consequences if you don't follow them. Because everyone has made a mistake in their life, sure. Obviously, and a veterinarian, if they made a mistake, yeah, we all have, and sometimes that can be, life ending, and it can be devastating. If they make that mistake, they need to, own up to it and actually recognize that the animals that's where my arguments always with valuation come in, because it's not going to matter if the court, will treat your animal like a toaster. And, what do these standards matter at all then? If they, if they're, oh, here's $50, go get a new animal. Right. That's not how we treat them. We spend thousands and thousands to bring them back to health. I would throw out my toaster when it breaks. I would never do that with my animals. Right. But I think, recognizing that the standards of care, these are basically like nationwide. Like, it's different. Like for attorneys, the difference is why we have to go to individual attorneys is because, or in your location, in your state, is because the laws differ drastically in many situations. But the standards of care for companion animals especially, is usually nationwide. So if you go, to Dr. Dodd's, you're probably going to expect that the standards of care are going to be the same as if you go, here in Chicago somewhere. They're going to be pretty darn similar. They should be, because there is that, the information is known to all of them, or should be known to all the accredited schools. But getting the veterinarians to recognize that standard and then hold themselves to that standard and hold others in the veterinary industry to that standard. Because one of the biggest problems we have in getting the cases reviewed is that veterinarians in the same locality, like I say, I have a case here in Chicago, I go to another veterinarian in Chicago, they're not going to want to say anything. They do not want to testify. And I've even had them testify under oath that they don't want to do that if it's somebody close, in their locality, because it does impact. I don't think they came out and said business especially, but it impacts their relations, because many of the specialists, those held to an even higher standard than a general practitioner veterinarian, the guy, or the one you go to after the GP has taken on something they shouldn't have and broken your animal's jaw, they right. don't necessarily want to talk about, what happened to the animal in that locality, because they may rely on those places for referrals or for business back and forth, and they don't want to be blackballed, in the community. And so that's why we often will have to go out of state, somewhere else. But it shouldn't be like that. It really should be that if a veterinarian, is seeing that another veterinarian, is not performing to the level they should be, they need to call them out. Because a lot of the disciplinary boards, which even judges get that confused. I had a judge very recently say, well, why don't you just take this up with the disciplinary board? It's like, well, one, that's a totally different avenue. Okay, that's not the civil avenue. We're not even supposed to use them against each other. Right. You can't use a disciplinary action to further a civil cause, and vice versa. It's not supposed to work like that. They're independent tracks, but two, the disciplinary boards, at least here, have not historically been that effective in changing any of the behaviors. And it's the only thing that's really going to change it is if there is monetary accountability, because the law can't give you, what you want back. I mean, I'm sure Scott would have, given anything to have Joey back, but the law can't give you that. They can only give you compensation, and compensation is it's a far cry from what you had, but it's more, even though civil law is not supposed to be punitive, it really is the only instrument of change, because
Right.
most of
Yeah,
the veterinarians are employed by businesses. The businesses are the ones that are accountable for the vet's actions and have to pay out of pocket. And if they stand to lose something monetarily, they're going to educate the workers. They're going to make sure that the veterinarians are held to that standard of care.
agreed. I think what my concern when we're talking about standard of care is that I think there's, or maybe I should ask you this. If we had one of the vets on tonight, this might help, but so you might not be able to answer this. When you talk about standard of care, are you talking about written standard of care, like absolute out of written, like we can use Joey's case for example. He was supposed to have a blood test. The drug company actually says a blood test should be taken to make sure the kidney level, correct, Scott?
Yes.
So that would be written to me. That's written standard of care. That is obvious, right?
No, here's the thing. Standards of care are not written really anywhere. They're kind of things that are developed over the course and scope of the work of the veterinarian. Now I will say in Joey's case, there was like a FDA black box label, like on the convenient. Like you can look at the manufacturer's instructions, and they call it black box. I'm sure there's other terms for it, but
Sure.
it says do not use with those animals whose kidneys are compromised. It says
Right.
it right on there.
Right.
But
Right.
if you ask Scott, did they ever tell you about this? Of course not.
No.
Did they hand you that? No, they didn't.
Right.
There was no informed consent there, because like there may be a situation where there is somebody who's looking at a black box warning and saying, all right, well, we have no other options. We may have to do this just to try to save the life. That's a different scenario than somebody who didn't even bother to read it, didn't bother to check the blood. But as far as like the things that should be done, you often go to textbooks, like you go to veterinary textbooks, if you want to call it written, sort of like that. But then most of the time, the veterinarians who are testifying, they base it on their experience, years in practice, and what is required, their continuing education courses, which they are required to take, just like attorneys, just like most professions. You have requirements, you have to take them. And you're supposed to then gain knowledge that will help you stay current in your field. Now, that's why they don't really have anything truly written, like a protocol, like this is exactly what we do. Sometimes, there may be something written in a vet clinic that this is our standard, here's what we do, there's check boxes. But as far as the standard of care, that's something that's a little bit nebulous. It's something that's why you get why you have experts with different opinions, because it's not, clearly written in, somewhere.
But that's what I think is the problem, is that the standard of care is going so low. It is so low. Vets are in a weird defensive way for them. They're taking on too many clients. They're busy. They're also, in their defense, also they're trying to, from a financial standpoint, you have a pet parent who's like, well, is there some way we can do this cheaper? And so little by little, the standard of care is just being chipped away. And that's my fear, is that then I can find 5 vets that say, yeah, I probably, under those circumstances, I probably would have done it that way too, which is why I feel like there needs to be a written standard of care that is like at the very basic level. These things should have been done. And
I agree. There should be something much more concrete, especially for certain set procedures, like with veterinary, or with veterinary dental. Like
I was just
they finally have articles out there that say, look, if you don't take x-rays before you extract, you're committing malpractice. It's pretty straightforward. But there are some people, that they'll still make arguments, like if it's an emergency, well, that might be different. But clearly, there's certain things that should actually, should absolutely happen. But with standards of care, a lot of times you're just going to textbooks, you're going to what people have done, in the past. But there is a concept in law that is important to know, because it may be applied differently in every state. But the industry itself can be too low. The standards can be too low. You can actually hold the entire industry saying, like, look, these standards are too low for the industry. And you can still find malpractice in situations like that. It's not as used in the courts, but it is available. So if they were to let these standards slip so low, basically as self-protection, that's not allowed, because those concepts just, it goes against the fairness, the notions of fairness. good faith,
Well,
fair play, that kind of thing.
because just from my experience, the standards are so low.
Yeah.
You'd given the example of the veterinarian who isn't changing the way he does something.
Yeah.
I nicked a dog one time and changed my whole way of doing things, right? So
Yeah.
and that's not a dog who got his jaw broken. We're The fact that they don't learn from their mistakes and move on, that's what raises the standard of care. One vet
Right.
makes a mistake, he changes the way it goes, and you continue on that way. But it just doesn't happen that way, and it comes right back full circle because our pets are only worth the amount of
Yeah.
what you paid for them. And so why should I bother spending the time
Mhm.
doing all of this if it's not going to cost me anything? And it breaks my heart to think somebody who went all the way through veterinary school and cared that much would lower the standard of care just simply because they're busy and they get in the habit of it. They become complacent. I've seen it over. You talk about the cat that got their leg cut off for sarcoma. I was witness to a cat who lost his leg, not from sarcoma. Wrong leg, got hit by a car and they accidentally did the wrong leg. But I just wish there was a way to get the standard of care up so that it would be easier to win these in court, because I think the standard is too low. I think the industry standard is too low. Giving a vaccine, for example, to a dog who has seizures is considered, like, especially rabies, when you talk about a rabies vaccine, because it's required by law. And even though the vial says, but every vet out there would still give the rabies vaccine.
Yep.
So how
At
don't
that
like
point, yeah, if there's like a contraindication is what they, kind of the word they use to say, like, look, if it says on the manufacturer's label you shouldn't be using this on this dog or that dog or what have you, then yeah, they better explain why they're using it. They better explain to the pet parent, yeah, here's why we're having to do it. And the pet parent then needs to either, the vet should know the law that says if an animal is not healthy enough to receive this vaccine, because that exists almost everywhere. I mean, you would really have to check. I would be pretty pressed to see if that didn't exist somewhere. I mean,
yeah.
even, even on mandatory things, it's there. If it would hurt the animal, they're not going to do it. They're going to
Right.
provide a different way. But yeah, there needs to be a lot more informed consent for sure. But there's
Yeah.
another area I did want to mention too about the standards of care, because in some instances, general practice there's different veterinarians. So there's certain veterinarians that have gone through extra school, extra training to become what's called board certified. So they maybe are veterinary dental, maybe they're cardiology, or various different internal medicine, various different specialties. They cannot call themselves a specialist unless and until they've passed those boards. But some general practitioners are taking on the roles of or just doing these, maybe, you know, thinking that they could do it, but they
Yeah.
really can't. But there's some interesting dialogue back and forth on what standards then they are held to, because we've had experts argue that, like, look, in that situation, if you're a general practitioner, you are clearly, and you're not qualified to do this, and you still do it, then you're still going to be held to that standard of the
Of the
expert
board certified.
specialist.
Yeah.
Right, as you should be, because, like, this is something that you should at least know what you don't know, and know that, like, hey, I can't do this. I'm not a cancer specialist. You need to go see somebody that knows cancer or something like that. So there are a lot of different areas in the standards of care that are nuanced but very important, and a lot of veterinarians should probably be more educated on how those apply in their
Yeah.
own practices.
Yeah. Scott, can you, just for some of our listeners, I know that you do a podcast where you do the whole story, but can you share a couple of examples of some veterinary malpractice? I know you get emails all the time, so there's probably numerous of these, but maybe share a couple of, you don't have to give the names or the whole story, but just some of the stuff that we're seeing that are coming across in veterinary malpractice. Maybe that'll help our listeners be a little more cautious as to what they're doing.
Well, the most common inquiry we get is regarding a dental cleaning that went bad. Most of the time, it's the patient was over anesthetized. Nobody noticed the dial was on 5 instead of 2 or something like that. By the time they realize that the patient's in cardiac arrest, they try to revive the patient. They fail, so the patient passes.